Intelligence collection in the electromagnetic domain has an asymmetry that conventional reconnaissance does not share. A satellite photographs what is below it. A human source reports what they observe. Neither activity requires the subject to do anything. Electromagnetic intelligence, the collection of radar emission signatures, communications protocols, electronic warfare responses, and sensor behavior patterns, requires the subject to operate. The subject must transmit. The subject must respond. The collection is passive, but the value of what is collected depends entirely on whether the observed platform performs in a way that reveals operationally useful information. The challenge for any intelligence collection program targeting a fifth-generation aircraft is that fifth-generation aircraft are specifically designed not to reveal operationally useful information. The F-35C's LPI radar emits in a way designed to defeat passive detection. Its communications use spread-spectrum protocols designed to minimize their electromagnetic signature. Its defensive and offensive responses follow procedures designed to deny the adversary a stable signature to catalog. The platform's operational philosophy is built around the proposition that what you cannot detect, you cannot learn from. There is one way to force a fifth-generation aircraft to reveal itself: give it a reason to respond. At 7:14 a.m. over the eastern Mediterranean, two Su-57 contacts appeared on the E-3 Sentry's radar picture, climbing from the Russian-operated airfield at Hmeimim in Syria. The characterization took 90 seconds and confirmed N036 emission signatures on both aircraft, RCS values consistent with the Su-57's documented frontal aspect, altitude 31,000 feet, and climbing heading 278 west into the Mediterranean. The contacts were 190 nautical miles east of the NATO cap station, where the F-35C section had been holding for the past hour and 17 minutes. The F-35C section had engaged Su-57 contacts on a previous rotation in this theater. The pre-mission brief had addressed the Su-57 as a high-priority intelligence collection target and had established specific procedures for managing any engagement to minimize the F-35C's emission signature while still developing sufficient fire control confidence to deter. The section knew the protocol. The section had practiced the protocol. The section had applied the protocol 11 months earlier against a pair of Su-57s in this same general airspace and had produced an outcome the intelligence community had spent 4 hours debriefing. At 7:14 a.m., the section began the established protocol: passive mode, APG-81 and LPI, EW suite, building the electromagnetic portrait of both contacts. The cockpit at 38,000 feet over the eastern Mediterranean was cold against the canopy glass, minus 56 degrees Celsius outside, 18 degrees inside the pressurized volume, and absolutely quiet except for the oxygen regulator's steady hiss and the distant low-frequency vibration of the F-135 engine transmitted through the seat. The HMD was populated with the Sentry's Link 16 picture. Two contact symbols bearing 098, range 190 nautical miles, altitude 31,000 feet, and climbing. The target diamond that the APG-81's fire control mode would eventually place on the contacts was not yet active. The EW suite's passive display showed two N036 emission sources at the correct bearing, their pulse patterns logging steadily into the characterization database, their power levels and frequency characteristics building the portrait the section would use to determine when and how to respond. The Mediterranean below the cloud layer was not visible from this altitude. The sky above was clear and cold, and starlit on the western horizon where the sun had not yet reached. Everything was exactly what the protocol had been written for.
This was the expected response. The expected response was the point.
The Sentry's radar picture at 7:14 a.m. showed two contacts. The picture was accurate. At 7:14 a.m., two Su-57s were climbing from Hmeimim, and they were real, and they were heading west, and everything about them was exactly what the pre-mission brief would have led the F-35C section to expect from a Su-57 presence sortie. The same general geometry, the same altitude profile, the same N036 emission characteristics that the previous rotation had documented.
What the Sentry's radar picture did not show at 7:14 a.m. was the third Su-57.
The third contact was at 31,000 feet, bearing 098 from the F-35C section's cap station, range 284 nautical miles. It had been at that position, with that bearing, at that altitude, for 31 minutes before the two Hmeimim contacts appeared. It had been there when the F-35C section launched at 6:12 a.m. It had been there when the section was established on the cap racetrack at 6:29 a.m. It had been there through the first 45 minutes of the section's routine orbit, its N036 in standby, no emissions, no transponder, no Mode C, no digital communications. It was not on the Sentry's radar picture because it was not transmitting anything the Sentry could detect, and because its radar cross-section at 284 nautical miles from the Sentry's APS-145, from the specific aspect angle the Sentry's radar geometry presented, was below the APS-145's reliable detection threshold, not below detection in principle, below detection from that specific geometry. The third contact had been positioned 31 minutes before the Hmeimim pair launched, at a bearing and range from the F-35C cap station that maximized the N036's passive collection coverage volume against the expected F-35C operational sector, the sector where the F-35C would be operating if it followed the established NATO cap protocols for responding to Su-57 contacts in this theater. The positioning had been calculated. The patience required to hold that position in standby for 31 minutes, transmitting nothing, was not an accident of fuel economy. It was a collection posture. The third Su-57 was not there to be intercepted. It was there to observe the intercept. At 7:16 a.m., the F-35C section's APG-81 was building its passive picture of the two Hmeimim contacts. The LPI emissions from the APG-81, compressed burst transmissions, frequency-hopped low detectability, were propagating in all directions from the F-35C, including toward bearing 098. At 284 nautical miles, the LPI emission level reaching the third Su-57's N036 passive detection suite was below the level that any previous technical assessment had rated as detectable by the N036 in this geometry. Below the assessed detectable level, not below the actual detectable level. The actual detectable level was a classified number that the technical assessments bounded with a confidence range. The lower bound of that confidence range was 284 nautical miles. The third Su-57 was at exactly 284 nautical miles. At 7:18 a.m., the two Hmeimim contacts reached 220 nautical miles from the F-35C section. The LPI fire control solution on Contact 1 had reached 44% confidence. Contact 2, 41%. Both below employment threshold but building at the established rate. At 7:19 a.m., the Sentry controller transmitted to the F-35C section. Falcon lead, Sentry. Third possible contact bearing 098, range 284. Intermittent return, RCS below threshold for type confirmation. Assess possible additional contact but low confidence. Continue monitoring. Intermittent return. The Sentry had found something at bearing 098, not because the third Su-57 had activated any emitter, but because the Sentry's APS-145 had produced a low-confidence return from the Su-57's physical airframe at a range and aspect where the APS-145's sensitivity was marginally capable of resolving it. Low confidence. Not confirmable as a type.
just a hint in the noise at a bearing that was exactly where the analysis later determined the third Su-57 had been positioned.
The lead registered the Sentry's transmission and noted the bearing, 098. The assessment was low confidence. The geometry required a decision about whether to devote attention to an unconfirmed contact at 284 nautical miles while managing a confirmed dual Su-57 approach at 220 nautical miles.
The protocol for the confirmed contacts took priority. The established procedure said, "Address what you can confirm." The unconfirmed contact at 284 nautical miles could not be confirmed without active radar on a bearing where active radar would reveal the F-35C's position to something that might or might not be there.
The protocol produced the response the third Su-57 had been positioned to observe. The F-35C section's APG-81 remained in LPI mode, focused on the two confirmed contacts at decreasing range. The EW suite's attention was allocated between the two N036 emission sources at 220 nautical miles and the bearing 098 anomaly at 284 nautical miles. The bearing 098 allocation was passive listening only. No active mode, no directional emission, nothing that would reveal the section's awareness of the possible contact. At 7:21 a.m., Contact 1's N036 shifted to a narrow sector scan toward the F-35C section's position. Not fire control mode. A refined search, the N036 operator narrowing the scan toward the sector where the F-35C's LPI emissions might be detectable if the N036 was operating in its most sensitive passive collection mode. The Hmeimim pair had not been loitering at 220 nautical miles without purpose. They were the active collection element, pressing toward the F-35C section specifically to generate the emissions that the section's APG-81 would produce as it built fire control solutions. At 7:22 a.m., the first friction event, the APG-81 LPI mode produced a momentary step-up in emission power as the system's automatic gain control responded to a degraded return from Contact 1, a brief 0.3-second period where the LPI emission level was approximately 11% above its normal operating level. The step-up was within the system's design parameters. The system's automatic gain control was functioning correctly, but 11% above normal LPI emission level for 0.3 seconds, propagating toward bearing 098 at 284 nautical miles. That was 0.3 seconds of elevated signal that the N036's passive detection suite at 284 nautical miles was specifically positioned and specifically tasked to detect. The third, Su-57's N036 did not activate. No emission from bearing 098 appeared on the EW suite's passive receiver. The N036 remained in standby throughout the 0.3-second step-up event, but the absence of an emission was not the same as the absence of collection. The third, Su-57's N036 passive detection mode could collect without transmitting. The collection was occurring in the electromagnetic equivalent of silence. At 7:24 a.m., the F-35C section's fire control solution on Contact 1 reached 67%. Contact 2, 63%. Both approaching the threshold at the rate the established protocol had modeled. The two Hmeimim Su-57s were now 196 nautical miles from the section and closing at Mach 0.94. The protocol called for full-power APG-81 activation at 68% confidence on Contact 1, which was approximately 2 minutes away at the current solution build rate. At 7:25 a.m., the second friction event, and the one that changed the engagement's character entirely. The EW suite registered a new emission from bearing 098, not the N036. A different system, a frequency and pulse pattern that the threat library resolved in 1.4 seconds as an L-band active phased array radar operating in a specific mode associated with the Su-57's AES, a L-band wingtip array. The Su-57 carries L-band AESA elements in its leading edge wing extensions, a secondary radar array that is less capable than the primary N-036, but that operates in a frequency band where Western LPI radar systems have documented vulnerability to detection due to the different propagation characteristics of L-band versus X-band frequencies. The Su-57's L-band array was not a fire control radar. It was a detection system, and the emission that had appeared on the EW suite's display at 7:25 a.m. from bearing 098 was not a search sweep. It was a confirmation sweep, a brief, targeted transmission designed to verify that a faint return the passive suite had been tracking for 11 minutes was actually what the passive suite thought it was. The faint return the passive suite had been tracking. The F-35C's APG-81 LPI emissions, including the 0.3-second step-up at 7:22 a.m. The third Su-57 had been tracking the F-35C section's position for 11 minutes through passive collection. The L-band confirmation sweep confirmed the position to within the L-band array's resolution at 284 nautical miles, a position fix that was now in the third Su-57's mission recorder, along with 11 minutes of APG-81 LPI emission characterization data, the section's maneuvering pattern, the specific LPI mode the APG-81 was using, and the gain control step-up events timing and magnitude. All of it collected, none of it requiring the third Su-57 to be detectable. At 7:25 a.m. and 47 seconds, the lead transmitted to the Sentry. Sentry, Falcon lead. Bearing 098 contact has activated L-band confirmation sweep. Assess third, Su-57 at 284 nautical miles, confirmed positioned. Has been passively collecting our emissions for a minimum of 11 minutes. Hmeimim pair assess as collection-enabling decoys. Request guidance. Collection-enabling decoys. The Hmeimim pair's function was now identifiable in retrospect. They were not the primary intelligence collection asset. They were the stimulus. They had been launched specifically to cause the F-35C section to execute its intercept protocol, which would cause the F-35C section's APG-81 to emit in a predictable pattern, which would allow the third Su-57's passive suite to collect the APG-81's LPI parameters in an operationally realistic context, not in an exercise, not against a surrogate emitter, but against a real APG-81 conducting a real fire control solution build against a real threat.
The intelligence value of 11 minutes of real APG-81 LPI emission data from an active fire control scenario was categorically different from anything the Russian electronic intelligence program could have collected from any other source. The LPI emission characteristics of the APG-81 in its fire control modes, the specific pulse patterns, the frequency hopping algorithm, the gain control response timing, were the parameters that the N-036's next-generation passive detection capability needed to reliably detect the F-35C at extended range. If the Russian program had collected sufficient data from this event to update the N-036's detection model, the detection threshold distance that the previous Mediterranean engagement had established as 98 nautical miles might be shorter in the next engagement.
The Hmeimim pair's guidance to reverse course came from the Sentry's transmission at 7:26 a.m., passed to the F-35C section as an instruction. Do not activate full-power APG-81 against the Hmeimim contacts. The decoy function of the pair depended on the F-35C section continuing the intercept. Terminating the intercept denied the third Su-57 additional collection at closer range, but could not undo the 11 minutes already collected. the Hmeimim pair turned east at 7:27 a.m., apparently receiving their own abort instruction. The third Su-57 was heading east already. It had turned at 7:25 a.m. and 41 seconds, 6 seconds before the lead's transmission to the Sentry identified it. The timing of the third Su-57's departure was before the F-35C section had revealed awareness of its presence. The third contact had completed its collection objective and departed on its own timeline. The three Su-57s were egressing towards Syria. The Mediterranean sector was clearing. The debrief ran 4 hours and 51 minutes. It was the longest debrief in the rotation by 42 minutes, and produced a finding that the intelligence community described in the product summary that would circulate above the operational level as the most operationally significant electronic intelligence development regarding the F-35C's operational signature in the previous 18 months. The first debrief finding was structural. The 3-aircraft architecture, 2 decoys and 1 silent collector, was a collection posture specifically designed to force a 5th-generation aircraft into a predictable emission pattern while maintaining a passive collection platform at a range and bearing that the responding aircraft's established protocols did not cover. The architecture exploited the F-35C section's prioritization of the confirmed threat over the unconfirmed anomaly. The prioritization was operationally correct under the established protocol. The protocol had not anticipated a scenario where the unconfirmed anomaly was the primary collection asset and the confirmed threats were the enabling mechanism. The second finding was the L-band array. The Su-57's L-band AESA wing extension arrays had been assessed in previous technical evaluations as a secondary sensor with limited operational relevance against 5th-generation platforms. The L-band confirmation sweep at 284 nautical miles against an F-35C conducting LPI mode operations confirmed that the L-band system's passive collection capability had been substantially developed since those earlier assessments. The ability to confirm a passive LPI track at 284 nautical miles indicated a system performance level that the previous assessment's confidence interval had placed in the possible but unlikely category. It was now in the confirmed category. The third finding was the APG-81's automatic gain control step-up event at 7:22 a.m. The 0.3-second, 11% power step-up was within the system's normal operating parameters. In a non-collection scenario, it was operationally insignificant. In a scenario where a passive collection platform was specifically positioned and specifically tasked to detect APG-81 LPI emissions at 284 nautical miles, the step-up had provided the most detectable emission the APG-81 had produced during the entire engagement. The intelligence community's assessment, the step-up event's timing and magnitude were the most likely trigger for the L-band confirmation sweep that followed 3 minutes later. The recommendation to the APG-81 engineering team: review the automatic gain control algorithm for scenarios where a momentary return quality degradation produces an emission step-up. The fourth finding was the one the pilots read twice. The intelligence value of what had been collected, 11 minutes of APG-81 LP, fire control emission data from an operationally realistic scenario, was assessed as sufficient in conjunction with previously collected data to enable meaningful improvement of the N036's passive detection model for the F-35C's LPI emissions. The specific data points that carried the most intelligence value: the gain control step-up event's exact timing relative to the return quality degradation, the frequency hopping interval during a sustained fire control build, and the power distribution across the LPI emission band at 4 confidence levels from 44% to 67%. Each of those values was a parameter. The N036's detection algorithm needed to reliably identify an APG-81 LPI transmission against background noise at extended range. The timeline for that improvement appearing in operational N036 software estimated 12 to 20 months from the collection date. 12 to 20 months. The operational consequence, in 12 to 20 months, the detection threshold that previous engagements had established between the N036 and the APG-81's LPI mode might be meaningfully closer than 284 nautical miles. Whether it would be 260 nautical miles, or 200 nautical miles, or something else, entirely depended on the quality of the data collected and the engineering resources allocated to integrating it. Both of those variables were above any information horizon the debrief could address. 2 Su-57 decoys from Hmeimim. 1 silent collector at 284 nautical miles. 11 minutes of APG-81 LPI emission data collected passively. 1 L-band confirmation sweep at 7:25 a.m. 3 aircraft egressing east before the section identified the architecture. F-35C fire control solutions employed against decoys, 0. Ordnance employed, 0. Collection objective achieved, confirmed by the third contact's departure timing. The eastern Mediterranean at 8:30 a.m. was clear and quiet. The Sentry's picture was empty of Russian contacts. The CAP section held station for 41 more minutes before the relief section arrived. 41 minutes of ordinary orbit above the sea. The APG-81 in LPI mode, the EW suite listening, the fuel state counting down at a rate proportional to the power setting and the altitude and the hours since the last tanker contact. An unremarkable orbit that no radar picture would ever show as significant. The mission recorder held everything. The intelligence product would say the rest.